To the moon and back, or maybe just the moon. Either way, NASA has awarded over $500 million in CLPS contracts on building lunar infrastructure as early as 2028. This infrastructure is intended to constitute a long-term stay and is part of the Moonbase 2 initiative that will put a permanent presence on our celestial roommate.
The space summer sale is off in full swing as a slew of different mergers and acquisitions took place. Holding true to our pattern of scope-style acquisitions dominating the space industry and the current wave of consolidation, Rocket Lab, SpaceX, Mitsubishi Electric, and the Exploration Company all make the cut of acquirers following similar strategies.
More companies look up for space domain awareness. Up north, that is. Poland and Canada show progress in space observation technology while America continues to go full steam ahead in this sector. Everyone is scrambling to get a better idea of what's happening above.
Welcome to this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer.
Here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, listen weekly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Well, to kick us off, our main topics this week include the lunar ecosystem, launch, and Orbital.
You sound real excited about that third one there.
It's what's
a
better?
Lunar launch and Orbital.
Starting us off this week on the moon, our major topics for discussion today include the lunar ecosystem, some changes in launch, and some on-orbit updates as well. Well, no point in burying the lead, but as we called out in the intro, NASA has awarded over $590 million in CLPS contracts for some upcoming Artemis missions that are scheduled to deploy in 2028. The big winners of these contracts are Astrobotic, Firefly, and to nobody's surprise, Intuitive Machines. $590 million is distributed roughly evenly. Each of these contracts is worth about $145 million on its own, with Astrobotic winning 2. So Astrobotic's contracts total $298 million. Intuitive Machines' single contract totals $148 million, and Firefly's single contract totals $144 million. So all of these contracts align with the Ignition Initiative, which in so many words constitutes basically a pivot from the Lunar Gateway or the cislunar orbital gateway that that you and I had sort of worked on back in the day, Harrison, and a little bit of a pivot from that gateway to more permanent lunar bases themselves, Moonbase 2 most namely, and it's noteworthy because these contracts themselves are not for demos. They are specifically intended to be the sort of initial infrastructural layer of the lunar capability that we're expecting to see go up. So, 2028 delivery, that means we're basically looking at 30 months or less, which is a pretty rapid turnaround for a delivery on a major contract on something as technically challenging as novel moon capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, all these companies have already attempted lunar landings, so it's not like it's their first time, I guess. I think the main value to this contract is that it speeds up their kind of turnaround time on landers and hopefully moves towards a higher cadence of development. It is kind of notable that a lot of their science payloads are not anything very new, which is odd given that the past couple of lunar contracts have had pretty novel applications. So to me, this is less like they're trying to scope out some new technology or survey some new land on the moon, and really just trying to fund these companies to build up their capabilities. I think it's notable given that Astrobotic just recently sold to Voyager, and Firefly just bought, was it Space-NG last week, to kind of fill out their core capabilities. So there's a lot of movement, at least with those two companies. on the capabilities that they're able to achieve with their landers. So I really see this as like a next generation improvement to their lunar landers, and hopefully in the case of intuitive machines, a lander that can actually stay upright or not run into the surface of the moon. But it's great to see that we have a variety of options here. I think Intuitive Machines was kind of snubbed in the last round of contracts for landers.
Yep.
So good they picked one up here. Firefly also, they only had the Elytra Dark mission, which wasn't a lander. It was like a drone. So good to see that their Blue Ghost is going back to the moon, since that's the only successful commercial lander to date. I was kind of holding my breath to see when they would get a contract, because found it very unbelievable that they wouldn't at all. So great contract. I think it funds the three most promising companies in the U.S. To continue their work developing landers, which we're definitely going to need as Artemis 3 readies for its mission, I think, next year.
Yep.
Granted, that's just an Earth mission, so not like they're carrying a lander, but everything's setting up for a moon mission soon.
To that end, Isaacman has sort of announced I'll say a common sense approach here, but we've got a spare Promise Martian rover. If we're going to the moon, why not throw that at the moon? So NASA has in the same week, for better or worse, NASA has in the same week announced the intent to sort of deploy the Promise Lunar or the Promise Martian rover to the moon for sort of similar purposes of just allocating more resources and prioritizing more capability to getting to the moon faster, de-risking different aspects of the moon, and standing things up sooner than later. So 2028, super ambitious, but doesn't seem impossible.
Yeah, let's nuke the moon. That's what we wanted to do after ignition, right?
I know that sounds right. I think I read that. I think I read that book. Yeah.
Yeah, they're getting a little testy. We got to put them in their place. Hopefully the rover actually lands. We haven't had too much issue landing on the moon, besides maybe Intuitive Machines, but I don't know, because you did call out like Astrobotic didn't make it to the moon, and technically they like made it around the moon, but then they like got a fuel leak and had to go back to Earth to deorbit. So that makes me nervous that like you put it on a rover that has to deorbit in the Earth. A nuclear rover would not be great.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm a little cagey. I'm a little nervous about this one because I feel like we haven't nailed the lunar landing aspect yet. So to be already moving on to nuclear enabled hardware seems a little premature, but hopefully in the next couple of years we can get there. I mean, Astrobotic has their Griffin lander planned for November. I would think Blue Ghost can get there sooner than 2028, but yeah, those CLPS contracts are scheduled for roughly the same time frame. So I'm guessing they're going to put Promise on one of those landers, which I hope it all goes well.
The power plant for the Martian, now lunar rover, for the Promise rover, is like the power plant. Yes, it is nuclear. It is very, very small.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real risk. Like, they're not supposed to burn up in the atmosphere or anything.
No, like that is objectively bad, to your point, that like we definitely don't want that.
Yeah.
But like I can sort of understand why I can sort of understand why that wouldn't be viewed as like the biggest concern from Isaacman's NASA administration, because their goal is so clearly getting a nuclear reactor, a permanent nuclear power plant, onto the surface of the moon. And this could theoretically sort of like technically check that box, which, if you're going to check a box, to technically check it is the best kind of correct.
I think it's very capital efficient and clever on the part of NASA. So I'm all for it.
On the commercial side of things, without partnership with NASA, Lunar Forge came out of stealth, targeting a 2027 first lunar demonstration. They are effectively a 3D printing laser sintering company using regolith and leveraging ISRU. They came out of they came out of stealth with the intent of getting some hardware and some demonstrations up onto the moon itself using regolith by as early as, I believe, 2027. which partners pretty well with the Instinct Space and Polymech announcement that came out, which is a separate commercial effort, partnership between these two companies focused on providing access to lunar regolith to their commercial partners in roughly that same time span. So I would not at all be surprised to see Lunar Forge getting their first payload up with an Instinct Space and Polymech promotion. But there's ongoing excitement and growth in getting to the moon and using the resources available, in this case, lunar regolith, to generate structures and to help build physical infrastructure that's there.
Yeah, I met the Lunar Forge CEO earlier in the week, and right before they announced they're coming out of stealth, and it sounded ambitious, but then like they come out of stealth, the Clips Awards go out, this Instinct Space, the partnership comes out. We're like, okay, you know what? This is actually not the craziest thing I've heard. I would much rather see something like this as a payload than some science payload, especially since most of these rovers have enough mass to carry the kind of hardware that she was talking about. And, you know, most of what Lunar Forge's hardware is the laser sintering device to melt regolith together. And the other part is like a sorting device. So a lot of lunar dirt is metal, iron, titanium, zinc, everything you need to kind of create an alloy for building structure material. And the way it was described was that it's originally intended for the containment centers for nuclear reactors, which is one of the key tenets to the ignition effort. But there's nothing preventing it from building other structures. I think that's just one of the highest value structures in the near to medium term, where it's a lot cheaper to build most of the structure on the moon if you can just send up the equipment that can do it. That just means the only thing you need for the nuclear reactor is what they're positioning as a 28 kilogram core to actually generate the power. So I think, yeah, like you said, a partnership there would make a lot of sense. If they can find space on a lander, I think it would be a great demonstration of a capability that is needed if we're going to build out actual infrastructure on the moon. Speaking of crazy missions, in the launch section this week, we have Catalyst Space's Link spacecraft successfully deploying to orbit. This is a mission that we've been following closely because it is awesome. It is the mission to raise the Swift Observatory that NASA contracted Catalyst Space to build a spacecraft to do. They built this spacecraft in 9 months, and they launched it with a fairly unique launcher, the last of its kind, really. It's an air-based launcher, the Cygnus XL, that's launched off of Northrop Grumman's TriStar vehicle. This is the last Cygnus to be launched, and they're using it for this awesome mission. They had originally planned to launch on June 30th. So last week when we were recording, I was constantly refreshing, the flight tracker to see if they had actually gone up, but looks like they got delayed due to some weather issues and some, fixes they needed to make to the spacecraft at the last minute. But on July 3rd, yesterday, they launched off the Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific and successfully deployed Link to orbit, where they made contact with it within a few hours. So great start to the mission. It was a definite, long shot just to get it here in 9 months. To then successfully get on orbit with a launcher that's very rarely used is another huge accomplishment. And now it's just a matter of them commissioning and getting to the spacecraft and raising it, which, is a lot of work left to go. But if, getting to this point is any indication, I think the team's fully capable, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out.
Yeah, Catalyst has already done the hard part, and now they get to tackle the harder part. So to the team, like, this is a huge win.
I was wondering where you're going with that.
Yeah.
The easy part is grappling a satellite and VLEO with 3 robot arms that never been used before.
Yeah, I wouldn't quite go that far. Yeah.
For comms mega constellations, we have a couple of updates this week. Amazon Leo has launched the last of their Atlas V rockets. So they bought, I think, 6 Atlas Vs, and they've been using them to launch their Leo constellation. This is the last of those contracts, and so it's also the last Atlas V to launch satellites. The ULA is decommissioning the rocket. There are still 6 contracts out for Boeing Starliner, but this is kind of the end of the era for that vehicle.
Yeah.
Obviously, setting them up for Centaur, which has had its own issues, or Vulcan, Vulcan Centaur. But it's good to see that the last mission went off without a hitch. It successfully deployed 29 satellites for LEO Mission 8, and this now puts Amazon LEO count at 396 in orbit, which gets them ready for service. They now have enough satellites to actually start operating. They have it's a good step. They have a long way to go before they're fully deployed. They have another 1,000 or so satellites to deploy. To do that, they've bought 38 launches with Vulcan. Once it finally gets back from review after the solid booster failure of the last launch. Right. 27 launches with New Glenn once that one stops blowing up on the pad and they've rebuilt what they have to launch it. They have one more launch with Ariane 6, which they've done one launch with them before. And they've recently bought 10 Falcon launches, which they seem very reluctant to do. So they're basically using every rocket to get Amazon LEO up there, which, up to a month ago, I was thinking like, yeah, it makes sense. Just throw everything at it because you need to meet your deadline. But around that time, we saw the FCC relax on their deadline for Amazon LEO and the license they have to use their spectrum. So I don't know if they're feeling any breathing room here, maybe a little bit now that they can be operational and start making some money. But yeah, that's it's good that they at least made it to that point.
So the sort of politics of what played out are that the FCC did not revoke Amazon's spectrum rights, and they specifically cited the desire to maintain a competitive market, to avoid a monopolistic market. That being said, there is no way, shape, or form to possibly read that doesn't involve Amazon getting chewed out pretty extensively. So like, hey, you've been trying to do this all on your own. It has not been working. We're not going to punish you, but you do need to get help. You need to go out and just solve this by whatever means necessary. So the fact that they're finally sort of calling in and getting launch and capacity on any and every vehicle that they can is good to see. It's what I would fully expect from them after that sort of ruling. Whether or not they have sort of breathing room for their operations a little bit now that they're able to actually start generating revenue, there's probably a collective sigh around the office. There's probably a collective sigh of relief around the office. But again, to use the same mantra, great, the hard part is over. Now for the harder part. We got our first 10% of assets up. Now we need to somehow figure out how we're going to get the next 90% up. I'm sure everybody is celebrating the holiday this weekend, and I'm sure everybody had a nice sort of relaxing Friday at the office. And I'm pretty sure that, come Monday, it's going to be pedal to the metal again for everybody involved. There's just a lot that needs to be done because they are so far behind schedule.
Yeah. AST can also breathe a sigh of relief here as they put 3 more Bluebirds up to orbit on a Falcon 9 rocket. They're also very reluctant to use Falcon. But I think this launch shows that, this is kind of the only ride in space that makes sense still. They launched Bluebird 6 on the LVM-3 rocket out of India late last year, and that was one Bluebird. And then they tried to launch another Bluebird on New Glenn, the one that blew up. That was
no. The Bluebird 7 was not on the one.
Oh, the one before that blew up.
Bluebird 7 was the one that made it to, I think, 100 kilometers altitude, 400 or something to that effect.
And then it blew up on its way down.
That's right.
So yeah, they finally caved on Falcon 9, which I find it interesting that they were able to launch 3 Bluebirds on Falcon 9, which is, if you can count, more than one. And that to me seems like they should have just been doing that from the start. I mean, the LVM is a cheaper rocket. I'm sure New Glenn was giving them a huge discount since it's like one of their first launches. But even then, it's not a third the cost of a Falcon 9. It's like half the cost of a Falcon 9. So this seems beneficial for them to get more satellites up. I know their stock was taking a hit with the miss of that last one.
Yep.
And the loss of New Glenn, which is what they were kind of relying on. And so this gets them back on track. I would imagine they'd continue launching the Falcon 9. I don't see them going back to the LVM, especially given the unreliability of that vehicle. And they have to wait on New Glenn. So I don't think they can wait that long or have that much uncertainty about continuing to deploy. I think against both Amazon and AST's wishes they're going to have to rely on SpaceX for now, which is a very interesting dynamic given that Starlink is their biggest competitor. I'm sure they're not happy giving their money to their competitor, but that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles right now.
Yeah, I think I mean, I agree with everything you said. I think my biggest takeaway from this is to sort of show how prevalent the desire to find other ways to try and work around SpaceX is throughout the industry. SpaceX is sort of the cost leadership provider throughout basically the entirety of the space industry, from launch through sort of service providing as well. And what we've seen is we've seen a premium, a risk premium that folks are willing to pay in order to not be beholden to that sort of one cost leadership player. So there is definite demand in the market for other avenues, for other providers, for other players. There's widespread desire and hunger for a competitive marketplace. And so we're seeing some of the big players exhaust any and all means of problem solving before needing to then go and take the cheapest or the quote unquote easiest option. And you know, we've seen some risks play out in an unfortunate way for some of these folks, but I think it's very telling that everybody that we're talking about has gone out of their way to try and avoid needing to go through SpaceX first.
Yeah, including Planet, who is now trying to add another launch vehicle to their roster of ways to get to space. This week they signed an agreement with ISAR to launch a Pelican on the Spectrum launch vehicle. So Pelican is their larger imager spacecraft, larger than the Dove, that is. So this is a 200 kilogram satellite that they're going to launch on a rocket that can carry 1,000 kilograms. So either, you know, ISAR can't fill out that docket since this is supposed to happen supposed to happen in late 2026. So it's likely that, you know, nobody really wants to sign up until ISAR proves they can launch. Or they're just, you know, until they can get reliable data from launching, they don't want to pack the rocket too heavy. So, you know, if Planet's lucky or maybe unlucky, they can probably hitch a ride on the current Spectrum vehicle that's been delayed for the past 4 months to keep scrubbing through all their launch windows. I think it's a huge affirmation for ISAR. Planet's a big company. ISAR is a German sovereign rocket provider, one of 3 or 4. And arguably one of the furthest along. There's companies like RFA that just got a bunch of money from OHB last week. There's companies like High Impulse that kind of also came up in the news this week. But ISAR is showing some real progress, if not for some delays, but what's new in the launch industry. And I think this partnership is a really strong move by the German government to develop sovereign capability, as Planet has a strong presence in Germany, where they manufacture some of their satellites, including the Pelican. So this mission, this partnership is a strong demonstration of Germany's ability to manufacture and launch their own satellites. One of the strongest space sovereignty plays out there.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty validating sign for ISAR that Planet Labs wants to launch with them and is willing to do so. I also think it's pretty revealing that Planet Labs is purportedly just putting up one Pelican on this bird. They're, you know, sort of hedging a little bit. They don't necessarily want to put all of their eggs in the one basket, assuming that it's either going to get scrubbed and delayed or that something might go wrong with the actual launch itself. Still a pretty strong validating signal for ISAR that, you know, folks still want to work with them, even if it takes them a while to get it right. And folks clearly trust that ISAR is going to continue to work to get it right.
For Australia, there was a interesting development where Southern Launch raised $25 million. This is one of Australia's more mature space companies out there. Australia is not a huge space player, but they do have some interesting companies that are making outsized impact relative to their presence in the industry. We recently talked about Gilmore Space raising hundreds of millions of dollars to build their rockets. So I find this raise by Southern Launch interesting because it's a significantly smaller raise, but they have more of a track record, mostly in the launch base kind of facilities aspect of their business, but they do launch rockets. They've launched their first rocket back in 2020. Right now, they do mostly hypersonics testing and suborbital flights. that's usually a precursor to larger launch vehicle efforts, but it's a way to generate revenue now and flush out technical capability. I think what I find most interesting about Southern Launch is their Kuniba re-entry range. So they have the Kuniba and the Whalers Way launch sites, but the Kuniba site is also a re-entry site. So Varda uses that pretty significantly for their re-entry of capsules, and it's a very unique offering. I've seen a couple other locations like Portugal and I believe New Mexico talking about creating their own re-entry sites, but it's a very nascent portion of the industry. It's one that's growing rapidly now that Starfall is a thing, and there are dozens of companies that want to do re-entry kind of capabilities. So they're going to need a site like the Kaniba range. And I think that is very valuable. That Southern Launch already has that operational and they're actively using it. And that can generate them revenue and position Australia as a valuable portion of the space industry. In China, there are a couple of interesting updates this week. Hongqing raises 191 million, led by China Construction Bank and ICBC. This is to build satellites. So Hongqing is a satellite manufacturer that is a affiliate company of Landspace. So Landspace has this UK launcher. We talked recently about them launching their UK2 a couple of times to actually deploy satellites. So they have an operational launcher, which is still pretty rare in China. There are only a few companies outside of like a Long March, which is a nationally owned business that can actually reach orbit. So they have this UK3, which they're still working on. That's a reusable rocket, but they also have the satellite builder affiliate, Hongqing, which is doing interesting stuff on its own, which I think together with Landspace makes it for a very interesting Chinese company being able to have this full capability. It looks a lot like a SpaceX or a Star or a Rocket Lab, maybe more so like SpaceX since the UK copies a lot of the Falcon 9. But the Hongqing is very similar to like the Starlink facility up in Seattle. So they've raised this money in order to continue building out their Hongyu 3 constellation. They had filed recently for 10,000 satellites for a communications constellation. That's what the Hongyu 3 constellation is. And the Jinwu 200 is the satellite that makes up the constellation. So it's a flat pack satellite, much like Starlink, that uses Krypton Hull thrusters and performs communications capabilities. This is one of 3 primary constellations in China, the Guanhua and the Qianfan being the 2 major ones. Those are actively deploying. They had 4 launches last week. They had 2 launches this past week for both constellations. So those are going up and also in the thousands of satellites count. So 10,000 is also quite large. There's a couple of other constellations like the CRC1 and CRC2 that have like 900,000 satellites. So there are much larger constellations coming out of China. But this one, I think like we said yesterday, when we see more reasonable numbers, it's much more like reassuring that this is an actual play. And 10,000, while a lot, is basically how much Starlink is now. So I look at this company together, Landspace and Hongqing, very similarly to basically China's SpaceX, or at least that's what they're kind of trying to make it become.
I think it's a very fair comparison to say that China has sort of scoped and sized SpaceX and is trying to sort of replicate that internally with a merger like this. The fact that that SpaceX had the biggest IPO in history and is such a gigantic company today, like getting 900,000 satellites up is not feasible. That's just not going to happen. If they get 9,000 up, it'll be an absurd success, and they will be valued at $1.5 trillion overnight. Like it's get 9 satellites up, and we'll high five you because that's a big accomplishment already. But yeah, they very clearly sort of set their sights on replicating or copying and as much as they can from SpaceX's success.
Yeah, and usually when we talk about China, they have a lot of rocket companies. I think that's the thing I give them the most credit for is they are not moving towards a kind of locked in environment for launch vehicles. But most of them copy SpaceX in a lot of ways. What I found interesting this week was Nayuda Space said that they're exploring using their rockets as orbital data centers, which basically copies Cowboy Space. So that's
the Aetherflux. Yeah.
Yeah. Very odd to be copying such an early company. It's yet to be seen if that's actually a good idea. I think on paper it sounds actually kind of reasonable for as crazy as ODCs are to go that route. And I think it does set them apart from some of the other Chinese rocket companies, especially given that their rocket itself is designed pretty differently. Their Xinyao R rocket is still in development, and it uses a belly flop technique to land its first stage, which is.
I couldn't remember if this was the launch company that adopted the belly flop technique, but if it is the one that decelerates laterally, that's all sorts of innovation that they're trying to merge together. That's great.
I think so too. I think that they're copying a couple of things that haven't quite worked yet. So I feel a little more like, okay, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery in this case, because you're copying things that haven't been done. When you copy like landing legs and grid fins, like SpaceX has been doing that for 10 years, you're just copying what has already worked. So there's no real innovation there. But Nayuda is taking two new concepts that haven't been fully proven out and are pursuing them as well. So I think there's less so that they're taking something that they already know that works and implementing it, and more so taking a new idea that's being explored in the West and implementing it in their spacecraft. So a very novel rocket, I would say probably the most unique out of the whole fleet in China. And I think it makes sense for China's approach. Like the only main announcements so far were like Changwon getting $2 billion for their orbital data center play. That was like 2 months ago. And they're proposing 16 satellites to accomplish like gigawatts of ODC capability. So China's definitely taking this like larger is better approach to orbital data centers, which is a very odd play to make. And Nayuda is kind of backing this up with their approach, which is like, if you're going to use a whole like Falcon 9 scale rocket to build an orbital data center, you're talking about like a megawatt per data center, which is much bigger than the kind of 100 kilowatt scale that we've been seeing across the industry. 100 kilowatts, way more feasible. Even right now, it's still pretty cutting edge, like 10 kilowatt, 20 kilowatt. That's pretty standard for a lot of high power buses. 100 kilowatts is pushing it. Starmine came out, said they're 120 kilowatts. So that's like reasonable range. But companies like Cowboy Space wanting to do effectively a megawatt satellite is kind of insane. Like the power systems on those are not trivial, and they're not very happy when they're in space. So there's just a lot of core hardware R&D technology that has to be figured out in order to scale to those kinds of sizes, which is promising given that Nayuda has spun up Alaya, which is the hardware R&D kind of department, with some of their money. So they're definitely not, taking for granted just saying big numbers and not having to figure out the engineering behind it, which I find another reassuring factor as to their approach.
Yeah, I think like there's a couple of macro things that I want to quickly point out here. But so, China's approach of like bigger is better is pretty in pretty big contrast to the West's sort of proliferated approach for things. The proliferation approach is largely because of the way in which power is generated for these orbital data centers. It's all solar. So solar scales with surface area, which means that you need to square the radius or the distance, the size of the solar cells, the size of the solar arrays, and so you wind up with a like a power density ratio that is pretty darn low. So if you want to hit these gigawatts of on orbit power in dozens of satellites, you need to drastically change that ratio. You need to drastically change that equation. And the only way that I can think of achieving that sort of power concentration is not through solar, it's through orbital nuclear. And we haven't heard anything about orbital nuclear power, in large part because of the concern that you raised earlier with Promise rover, just the idea of having a nuclear power plant overhead at all times is terrifying to everybody who worries about that sort of thing. So, I think that there's a lot of needs from the power side of things that have yet to be met. There's a lot of technological hurdles that need to be solved. I would not at all be surprised if the reason why China is pursuing a bigger is better approach is because they have simultaneously been pursuing some form of orbital nuclear power plant platform that sort of underpins all of this. Like, I wouldn't at all be surprised if that's something that they've been developing we've been talking about getting a nuclear power plant on the moon permanently. Russia has spoken about doing that. So, like, nuclear power in space is something that's already fresh on the mind. And I think this is indicative that China has sort of potentially has just decided solar is not the way that we're going to be able to scale and achieve the types of on orbit power needs that we want. And so they may already sort of be looking at that next wave of power backing as sort of how they're going to deliver on this. The second macro thing that I briefly want to point out is that Aetherflux pivoted to cowboy space 2 months ago at this point, earlier this year, but still, I'll round up. I'll call it at the beginning of summer. So Aetherflux made that pivot. Their background is in solar power and in solar energy. They don't have much of a head start in the rocket side of things, and the rocketry side of things. So Nayuda does build a rocket. So Nayuda wouldn't necessarily be like copying from any of the work that Cowboy Space has done. They may have just liked Cowboy Space's idea and internally decided, you know what? We think we may actually be a little bit further along than Cowboy Space is in solving this. And so Cowboy Space can copy us for all we care.
Yeah.
They may have just taken the idea and started running with it.
A pair of interesting announcements that normally I wouldn't include because they're basically just companies saying we intend to do this, but I found them in tandem to be pretty interesting, along with the fact that Planet is signing with ISAR. Is that Firefly is planning to launch out of Sweden's S-Range launch pad, as well as Latitude planning to shift their initial launch from French Guiana over to Oman at the Etlak launch pad. So both of these are interesting because when we talk about space sovereignty, we usually talk about satellite production being done in country. But
satellite production and launch providing.
But launch providing hasn't historically had that like relationship. Most launch vehicles are within the region that they're built for. But this is one of the first signs I've seen of it being more open. I think for a long time, the assumption, at least mine and probably broader industry, is that ITAR regulations and just trade in arms is kind of a restrictive factor to being able to do that. But, we sell missiles to other countries. We sell fighter jets to other countries. So there's not really anything that could prevent you from doing that. This is the first time I've seen an American rocket basically launch from outside of the U.S. So Firefly launching outside of Sweden was made possible because they signed a technology safeguards agreement, which is kind of the way to get around ITAR. It's only been done 6 times before. And this one enables the SSC, which is Swedish Space Corporation, to fulfill an $11.3 million agreement they made with the Swedish Defense Material Administration to launch the sovereign satellites with Alpha. So effectively, Sweden is gaining sovereign launch and satellite capability through this partnership with Firefly. It's quite interesting, given that we talk a lot about the Andoya spaceport in Norway. This is the Swedish spaceport S-Range. So there's a lot of activity going on up there, a lot of collaboration between multiple countries, although companies like ISAR out of Germany partnering with Norway was a lot less of a shocker than seeing the US partner with a European company or country to launch. I think in that same vein, seeing a French company like Latitude agree to launch out of the Middle East is somewhat new as well. We've seen other companies have these. This is kind of a growing trend we've seen, especially between France, because like Loft Orbital has the OrbitWorks joint venture out of the United Arab Emirates, and that's something that was echoed by Space 42 between Viasat and United Arab Emirates company to build out a constellation there. So there's just this increasing cooperation between Europe and the Middle East, but this is noteworthy given that it's a launch vehicle that we are giving to the Middle East. So definitely interesting trend. I'm curious to see if it continues, especially with so many new launch companies being stood up. This is a way to profitability that's different. And if they can get around the regulations, I think it's beneficial to a lot of these companies that are trying to get their legs under them.
Jumping up into orbit, China has announced the formation of a VLEO consortium for satellites currently on orbit and operating below 300 kilometers, and for satellites that will be going up and operating in that range. we've seen a multitude of different VLEO startups come out of stealth over the past year. So we know that it's a growing market with a lot of innovation in it. I thought it was interesting because the announcement seemed to indicate that China was pairing research institutions and universities with current commercial players. I believe, if memory serves, the numbers are ballpark of 36 different universities and about a dozen different research institutions with the current commercial players. And the announcement that I saw made it sound like the consortium was intended to sort of solve some of the propulsion challenges that you experience in the super high drag environment of VLEO. And I find this interesting because all of the commercial startups that I have seen come out of stealth, that I have spoken with, that I know are playing in the VLEO space, they are all propulsion companies. They are all companies that have some sort of propulsive secret sauce that they believe allows them to actually compete in and win and solve the fundamental sort of drag problem at that altitude. So it's sort of a unique partnership that I've seen. It's intended to be much more in like industry focused than research focused.
This whole thing seems a little premature to me. Like I said, there's only been 2 satellites in VLEO. It is an emerging trend, but none of these companies have sent one up yet. And China is not really any different in that sense, as far as I'm aware, although they would probably make for good spy satellites, so maybe they do exist. But to me, it reads much more like they want to make a concerted push for this technology, which I think makes sense, especially if they think they're behind the West in developing this technology. We've been noting it as a trend for a few months now, and it seems like something that the West is doing. And I feel like China would be one to say, like, if the US has sat like low Earth orbit spy sats, then we're going to have the same. And this is kind of their way to do that.
Moving a little bit closer to home, Vantor Space has announced Worldview 3D, which provides up-to-date 3D ground truth globally. It is not an offshoot, but it's also offered through their TensorGlobe spatial intelligence platform, and basically amounts to a global 3D imaging model that you can access new images within, on average, closer to about 6 hours, but the longest lead time for updated imagery is about 24 hours. So they have 2 different sort of distinct product offerings, one with much more of a defense focus, one with much more of a commercial focus. The way that they're marketing or framing them is that the defense focused product offering is all about rapid revisit rates, and it's all about getting as up-to-date intelligence as rapidly as possible. And then the more commercially focused product line is all about they're framing it as getting the highest quality imaging in a little bit slower time. So an interesting play here, and development from what we've seen there. The rapid turnaround is roughly 4-meter accuracy and 50-centimeter resolution, whereas the high definition is 15-centimeter resolution and roughly 3-meter accuracy. So they do have some different capabilities there, which means that they're leveraging a pretty robust fleet of assets to capture all of this data.
Yeah, this plays into a couple of really interesting trends that's been playing out in Vantor for years now. I think it came up back when they acquired Radiant Solutions and Drover. Well, we were there like a decade ago. So they've been working on it for a while, but I feel like within the past 6 months since we've been covering it, it's definitely hit a certain need, or like a need for it has kind of manifested that's slightly different than what the original intention was. So I think the original intention was like, it's like Google Maps, but better. And now there's 2, I don't know if I'd call them trends. One of them is a trend, but I feel like we haven't really been covering it because it's more on the AI side of things than the space side of things. But space is starting to play a bigger role in that, which is this need for world maps, or like a digital world truth source. We covered it a couple of times in the past few months. There was one company out of Asia that was doing something like a virtual world map. And there was Zupal out of Spain that raised a a ridiculous amount of money for like a Series C as they came out of stealth to do like a source of truth for the world. And both of those are to train AI models to have this kind of up-to-date source of truth about the world that you can train it against. So I think they're probably seeing a lot of value there. The other thing, when you gave the accuracy and the resolution numbers, that makes me think of is their alternative PNT solution. They demoed a few months ago, Raptor, that allows drones to look at geographic features and compare it against a source of truth that allows them to know where they are. At that level of accuracy, that's actually pretty good. Like 10 meters is kind of, it's not the best, but it's not uncommon for GPS resolution. So this could be a solution for that as well, to provide better position navigation timing solutions, which is a trend we've seen with the increase in GPS jamming, not just in conflict zones, but as we talked about recently, Russian satellites that actually jam GPS. So having the ability to find your location based off of visual cues is another huge value that can be derived from their data set.
In another effort to provide additional Earth observation information, Dominion Dynamics out of Canada has closed a $100 million US, roughly 139 million Canadian Series A to scale their Arctic surveillance network and drone systems. The round was led by Georgian, and the Series A will accelerate their AuraNet and Scout. Scout is their autonomous collaborative platform, which extends the reach of crewed fighter planes to austere environments while simultaneously growing their team to over 100 by the end of the year.
Yeah, it's a pretty big amount of money for a Canadian company, but I think it's playing into a capability that's kind of been around for a while, but has seen renewed interest as of recent, at least out of the US. You know, what Dominion Dynamics is doing is nothing new. It's battlefield management from a number of sources, one of them being satellite imagery. But it's to give battlefield awareness to fighters. I think some of this is interesting when they talk about drones, as this is kind of an emerging trend for some satellite technologies. We saw it last month when the USSF awarded, or as the USAF awarded $4 billion to SpaceX for their SBAMTI contract. That was a space-based air tracking system. And it's kind of a system that hasn't existed too much. We've talked a lot about communications for like airplanes being a thing, and we track them through communications signals that way, but that's when they want to be tracked. So there's this growing need for spacecraft that can track aircraft and UAVs when they don't want to be tracked. So there's kind of a technology here that's growing. SpaceX doesn't really signal a broader trend because they can do whatever they want, but seeing this pop up again with a Canadian company kind of signals that there's a growing interest in this from the defense industry. We have a few other kind of space domain awareness contracts that came out this week. Observable Space raised $90 million led by Lux Capital. This was alongside a $94 million United States Space Force contract for a mobile ground space domain awareness system. So Observable Space, they are an optics expert. They actually are one of the few companies that are able to manufacture adaptive optics, which are used in imagers. They're used in laser comms, which is a growing interest. And so they've been kind of up and down the stack, but I feel like this is one of the biggest moves to kind of produce a product that can be delivered to the end consumer. You know, most recently, I don't think we mentioned them by name, but they are involved in the laser communication system that Orion used to communicate from the moon. They're involved in a number of other systems as well, but this is like their own system that they can deploy. This is interesting because this company is involved in laser comm and space domain awareness, which are both huge sectors of our industry right now. So this raise comes at a very obvious time for them, where they can leverage their expertise to build out really capable systems. And that, it's a pretty big contract, $94 million to develop this capability. Certainly plays into the fact that space domain awareness is growing need. This is a ground-based one, so it's not really in the space-based arena, even though they are capable of that. But it is interesting that the Space Force is willing to spend so much money on this mobile SDA capability. I think it makes sense for some of the more mobile applications we've been seeing for, tracking satellites that might be spying on conflict regions, or jamming satellites that they might want to track, or just making sure that their on-orbit assets are safe when they need them most.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of capital, specifically from the Space Force and from I believe, Space Force and Golden Dome. But we've seen specifically a lot of defense money going towards ground-based SDA, and it, like, generally speaking, like, ground segment is usually referred to the ground segment for telecommunication purposes and for telecommunication network. But it's hard for me to not pair the two together, because we've seen the ground segment traditionally be viewed sort of as a bottleneck. And so we've seen, I believe it's Washington Harbor Partners, but we've seen multiple different companies effectively consolidating and investing heavily in the space, recognizing that the ground segment as a whole is largely a bottleneck, that it's something that has been underinvested and underdeveloped. And that as we continue to see more assets and more demand going up, that this is going to become sort of the gate that gets kept. And so it's interesting to see, like, additional needs. It's interesting to see the space domain awareness needs growing basically in tandem with the number and proliferation of assets on orbit, and to see that play out in real time. I think there's a lot of similarities between sort of ground-based SDA and the more traditional ground segment as well.
In a similar vein, Sibilla Technologies has secured $10 million in order to enter the U.S. market. So this is a Polish space observation company. They're also playing in that space domain awareness arena. They're less so on the hardware side of things and more so on the software side of things, where they kind of aggregate collected imagery and provide better awareness of space assets across a number of applications. So they do things like orbital debris as well. So this is somewhat to do is like space traffic management and just collision avoidance, but also in this broader like defense application of space domain awareness. It is interesting to see another European company expand into the U.S. We've seen it a couple times in the past few months where they see, all this money flowing in, and they want to kind of take a piece of that. I think the most notable part of this is that it's Polish, which I think last week we were commenting on how dominating Poland space technology has been in the broader context of European countries. For such a small country with relatively little background in space technology, they've had a wide variety of space technology that's not only getting funding, but getting a lot of great traction. They've bought huge contracts from other European space companies. I think we talked about, we've had like a thruster company that went public there, and they had like a laser comm company that went public there. So they are building out a very broad ecosystem of space capability and some really cutting edge stuff. So it's impressive to see another unique move by that region to kind of grow their capabilities this way.
Yeah, I continue to be impressed by how these companies in the Polish space ecosystem have managed to find ways to capital that are generally atypical. So there's definitely some like infrastructure or institutional things that Poland as a nation is doing differently that allow for smaller companies to conduct public stock offerings, that allow for companies at earlier stages to get access to more publicly available capital, that allow for more speculative investing in those regards. So like there's some things that they are doing distinctly differently, and that's definitely allowing for some of the rapid progress that we've seen.
Yeah, and for a company out of the U.S., we have Space Tango raising $7.4 million. This is primarily for in-space manufacturing and autonomy, although that autonomy is not in like the traditional sense we talk about, but more in the sense of in-space manufacturing. This company's worked across 300 different experiments already, and these are from 40 missions to the ISS. So, we've talked about this whenever we talk about in-space manufacturing. It's a very nascent market that's been slow to grow, but it has had a lot of experience in the ISS, just not at like commercial manufacturing scale. So This is interesting to note because Space Tango obviously has the background to understand how to manufacture in space, but they're playing more in like the logistics region of things rather than building out like their own on-orbit manufacturing hub. I find it interesting that they're able to raise this right after Starfall launched. I think we speculated that that was going to kind of destroy the market in terms of nobody could compete with SpaceX. This to me is a good sign that it really just validated the market and people are still willing to invest in this. And maybe it's a sign that this industry is finally starting to grow and might arrive sooner than, well, not sooner than we thought, but like soon, hopefully.
Yeah, I like the idea that that while SpaceX sort of surprise announcing their participation in this market, while that initially being scary, I like the sort of the counterpoint to that of like, well, they've actually validated the market. They've shown that, if it must really be this big and this lucrative because a company as well established as SpaceX is doing so, and there's now, there's now a lot more sort of legitimacy to it overall. So I think that's a very sort of glass half full way to view and approach it. Though the reality of the situation is that SpaceX is going to be in the cost leadership position of any service they provide. So everybody else who's sort of coming to the table looking to provide stuff in the orbital manufacturing or the downmass market or anything to that capacity, they will need to be able to do something differently. And the understanding is that they will be charging more than SpaceX is to do so. Nobody is going to be able to provide what SpaceX provides at the same or at a cheaper price point. So, hey, we're going to do this, but we paint everything blue and we sing you a song while we do it. Great. Like, there you go. There's your sort of differentiation. But where it comes down to like, well, we're providing a more bespoke service where we're providing this directly to the orbits or directly to the launch providers or the timing that our customers need rather than having some sort of like regular or standard cadence that you need to buy a ticket for. So it's really exciting to see additional capital going into the space, despite that sort of initial shock from Starfall's release. Moving on to the lightning round here, we've got a bevy of different acquisitions and mergers that occurred this week. Rocket Lab acquired Iridium, SpaceX acquired Mesh Optical Technologies, Mitsubishi Electric acquired Infostellar, and the exploration company acquired European Astrotech. So we're gonna jump in at the top and just sort of work our way down here. But Rocket Lab acquired Iridium. Iridium is already a publicly traded company, so Rocket Lab's acquisition is through a stock purchase. That stock purchase, I believe, at $57 a share, puts them at an enterprise valuation of roughly $8 billion. Iridium's sort of core product offerings is generally their radio network, their radio communications components and capabilities. They also had some narrowband technology for intersatellite links and intersatellite communications, neither of which generally show up on Rocket Lab's balance sheet. They don't generally have a whole lot of radio or narrowband technology. Their intersatellite links are largely through optical terminals. And what I think is probably the most critical or like the biggest reason for the acquisition is actually that along with that sort of core competency, Rocket Lab is also acquiring Iridium's L-band spectrum. And so we've seen time and time again spectrum be the most expensive non-existent land sold. We've seen billions of dollars for spectrum rights previously, and we do not expect that trend to really change at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if Iridium's sort of technological capabilities amounted to like 30 or 40% of the reason why Rocket Lab pursued this acquisition, and the remainder to primarily be the spectrum rights that they've now acquired as a result.
Yeah, it's an interesting play by Rocket Lab. I mean, it's just another move in the spectrum wars that have been ongoing with SpaceX's acquisition of EchoStar's Ka band spectrum, and then or S band spectrum, and then Amazon got Global Star's Ka band spectrum. Both of those are much more positioned towards broadband. Actually, no, I got that backwards. S band was Amazon Leo, Ka band was SpaceX. Both of those are much more positioned towards like broadband, cellular, direct to device capability. Iridium's L band is much more targeted towards like satellite phones and position navigation timing, maritime communications applications. It's much more low bandwidth capability. So I'm really curious to see what Rocket Lab ends up doing with that spectrum. They have some like subcontractor manufacturing roles to play in communication constellations that are already being built out. They were involved in Global Star's next generation of constellation, although whether that's going to continue after their sale to Amazon is unclear. But it seems that Rocket Lab is probably positioning themselves to build their own communications constellation. That seems like good planning, given that Neutron should be available soon. And as SpaceX and Blue Origin have proven, the best way to get your money out of your rocket is to launch your own constellation that then generates revenue. So I fully expect Rocket Lab to announce that they're going to have their own sovereign, like own independent constellation to do some sort of communications application. But I would expect it to be much lower bandwidth than straight broadband capability. I could still see some phone capability and some low throughput data applications. And L-band is useful for a lot of phones. Like we already use L-band in GPS receivers, which is in every phone. So definitely some ability to leverage phones that already exist, and they don't have to do some weird hardware play like had to be done with Apple's satellite phone capability. So really unique kind of acquisition. I think Rocket Lab will make the most of it. It's just not, I don't expect them to go directly head to head with somebody like Starlink. I think they're going to carve out their own niche. And I think it's going to be for like low throughput distributed application of technology. So maybe more like an IoT, like an industry kind of business to business kind of play there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I would think is pretty consistent with how we've seen Rocket Lab execute their integration strategies so far. Has been all around onboarding and building sort of a technical moat, and their ability to sort of cut out supply chain risks by in-housing that. So it would make sense that they're looking at going a little bit more sort of downstream now, no longer protecting their sort of inputs, now sort of protecting their outputs, wanting to go downstream and get directly towards the customer, so to speak. So that follows. I mean, the announcement in question was championing the acquisition as a now complete vertical integration on Rocket Lab's part, going from source all the way to customer. So they're able to do everything and a bag of chips.
Yeah, but there was like another announcement this week that I didn't include in the itinerary because we'll talk more about it later when it happens. But the FTC did just announce that they're going to do a second auction for C-band. So it's like 160 megahertz of spectrum that they're going to be auctioning off. This is the second time they've done this. Last time they raised $100 billion. So they're big players like spending money on C-band spectrum. But this is an open competition for the next section of that. I fully expect Rocket Lab to buy some of that spectrum, especially if they're making this play for their own constellation. I think a combo C-band, L-band spectrum is hugely useful. There are like large military implications there. They could get into the broadband field there as well. Like combined, that makes a lot more sense than only having L-band.
Yeah, C-band is generally sort of used for most of our modern communications, whereas L-band is more the lower throughput, to your point. So being able to cover both of those means that they'd be able to go end to end now with basically everything they would need. They'd be able to provide an entire swath of different products and offerings globally. So I agree with you that this is very consistent with sort of Rocket Lab's strategy, and I would be flabbergasted and astounded if they did not throw as much weight as they possibly could in this auction coming up. Moving on, we've got SpaceX, who has acquired Mesh Optical Technologies. They received expedited FTC approval to do so earlier this week, and the expedited approval process did not actually list SpaceX or SpaceX AI as the acquiring company, it listed Elon Musk as the acquiring company. So a wonderful sort of non-Freudian slip on the FTC's part there. But so SpaceX and Elon Musk will be acquiring Mesh Optical Technologies, which is founded by SpaceX alumni. They are in the business of providing optical transceivers for AI data centers, and their technology boasts some pretty impressive performance improvements over the competition. Most notably, that they're operating at a massive sort of power efficiency advantage. So Mesh raised a $50 million Series A back in February. The acquisition will be sort of completed in the coming months here, and I would expect to see this sort of an entire in one of these sort of the rarer examples. I would expect to see this basically in-housed and absorbed entirely in like a scale type acquisition, as opposed to the scope acquisitions that we normally see.
Oh, interesting. I disagree. I feel like Elon bought it outside of SpaceX to keep it kind of independent. I like this is a fairly unique capability. They're optical transceivers for communications, basically between slices within an AI stack. So, yeah, I think SpaceX is now playing heavily in AI, but I think this has implications outside of just the space industry. It can be used in data centers, and there's a growing use for fiber optic and just optical communications within data centers. We have companies like Light Matter doing optical chips, and there's a lot of fiber optic communication between those stacks, and NVIDIA has their own like NVLink that leverages this to have high data throughput. So my read on this is that a couple of people that started a company, raised a bunch of money, haven't delivered anything yet, but Elon still wants them making money for him. So this kind of skill set to build out this capability is pretty rare. To have some leverage over how that's developed will definitely benefit SpaceX, especially as they move towards Starmind and their orbital data center play. But I think even beyond that, there's still a lot of value to be had out of this company for other companies. So I think I made note of it last week that SpaceX is notoriously not an open market. There are a lot of other companies like Rocket Lab that will supply components to every other company that wants it, but SpaceX doesn't typically. They have been with their Placer technology. But I think with this, Elon might be looking more to sell the technology to other competing companies to make money from that as well. And if you were to in-house it to SpaceX, it would kind of, I don't know, keep it internal to theirs. And I think he understands that like this technology is going to arrive with or without mesh optical, and he'd rather be at the forefront of it by owning them. So yeah, my take on it is just he wants to have a stake in this. It's necessary for Starmind, but wants to have broader application to the general AI hardware market.
I think it sort of boils down to what SpaceX's ultimate, or I guess SpaceX AI's ultimate strategy in the ecosystem is. I mean, if they are intent, or if they plan big picture to sort of seed ground on the AI modeling layer sort of things, and focus more on sort of dominating and winning the compute layer, I could very well see like, okay, hey, we're going to buy this company that's sort of leading in this transceiver layer, that's going to be critical to that market, and let them do their thing. If they plan to be more competitive in the AI layer itself, I would think that this would be more about in-housing this and then customizing everything for their own purposes in a little bit more of that sort of scale type thing. But to your point, like, there's a lot of reason to believe that it wouldn't necessarily be that. But the fact that they executed their acquisition of Cursor for $60 billion sort of says to me that they're probably not going to be stepping back away from the AI sort of the AI modeling layer itself. So like it'll be interesting to see which way it pans out. But I would wholeheartedly agree with you that what you have described is exactly how I would expect them to go about executing on things if they were not planning on competing in the AI model layer.
Well, I mean, like I would more expect to see this company get integrated into Terafab, which is under Tesla, not SpaceX. So it might just be that, because Terafab's so early, Elon's not sure whether he wants to put it under SpaceX, or if SpaceX ends up buying Tesla, then it's kind of fruitless to merge it there right now anyway. But to me, like Terafab plus this company is a prime competitor for NVIDIA. If they can build their own chips and they have this company building the interconnect layer between all of them, they're essentially modeling what many people argue is the key differentiator for NVIDIA, or their moat. The moat is not that they can build chips, it's that they have this CUDA platform that everybody's built upon. They have the NVLink, which scales better than any other competitor. Like there's this whole infrastructure behind the chipset that enables NVIDIA to be, leading the market. I think, Terafab, if they create a cutting edge chip and they have this CUDA like system that leverages optical communications at a higher rate than NVIDIA can accomplish, that's their way of kind of leapfrogging the current state of the art.
So Mitsubishi Electric wholly acquired Infostellar to expand their ground station services segment for satellite operators. And this is sort of following up on that sort of ground segment discussion that we had earlier regarding sort of the SDA layer side of things. This one reads very much like Mitsubishi is basically buying up a whole bunch of infrastructure and a whole bunch of capacity from a relatively speaking sort of newer ground segment company. Infostellar, I believe, founded in 2016. But so interesting to see this sort of play out in real time. But the announcement indicated that this was an entire acquisition. They bought everything in the kitchen sink, and so I would expect to see Mitsubishi leveraging sort of this ground segment and this ground station layer that Infostellar has developed into their own sort of. I wouldn't expect to see Mitsubishi trying to then sort of turn that around and provide that exact same product to other companies. I don't think Mitsubishi is buying this as an investment. I think that buying this as a as is. I think they're buying this to then develop and further their own business efforts. I think they see that they are greater than the sum of their parts here.
Yeah, same trend we've seen elsewhere. It just seems like Japan's play at this. We've seen it in Europe and US. So Mitsubishi is a large contractor in Japan. This seems like Japan's way to increase their ground coverage capability.
Finally, for the mergers and acquisitions of the day, the exploration company has acquired the European Astrotech. So the exploration company acquired the UK-based propulsion specialist. The plan post-acquisition involves both growing European Astrotech's operations and activities while expanding TEC's own facilities to incorporate EAL's capabilities and technology. This is another scope style acquisition. It was explicitly the CEO of the exploration company explicitly stated that where they were going to leave European Astrotech alone, that they weren't going to change their operations, that they were just going to incorporate their products and in-house their capabilities. A lot of this reads like it's meant to service the NICS project that they're working on. That there is some additional sort of propulsive testing and propulsive capabilities that they want to bring in-house for their NICS capsule, which I believe is set to launch in 2027. But it reads very much like the sort of standard prototypical scope acquisition that we've seen so much of in the space industry.
Yeah, I mean, launch again. They launched last year and didn't go so well. So that's what I find most surprising about this, is that a company that hasn't had much success or flight heritage is able to acquire another company. Granted, they're both pretty small, so it might just be a merging of ability to kind of boost both of them. But it's odd. Like Rocket Lab didn't acquire electric propulsion company. York did, but I would think that an electric propulsion company would want to go with a company that has more use for their technology, like a Constellation company. So this seems like a merger, like an odd merger. Like exploration doesn't have the volume needed, or doesn't have the volume production that would really necessitate owning your supply chain. There could be some, you know, worries about having your supply chain choked if you have key deadlines, which like exploration companies contracted to be the service module for European space habitats. So there is some pressure there to make sure that they can deliver on time. It just seems a bit early for honestly for both companies. So to me, it reads more like, both teams are just merging their capabilities to be a stronger offering. I don't really see it as like a way for them to strengthen their supply chain in order to reach scale. So it's definitely an odd merging.
Yeah, both companies are pretty early. Both companies are relatively small. I think I would argue that this type of merger or acquisition is still, I would still categorize it as more of the same, as more of a scope acquisition. It just that this is sort of one between two smaller companies who are going to be closer to peers than between sort of like than what we've seen with the SpaceX acquisition or with the Rocket Lab acquisition, where it is like a very clear one company acquiring the other. But this acquisition is intended to follow that similar pattern, even though the two companies are sort of a little bit more similar in size. But I think it is a one of the more unique examples of this pattern that we have seen. Draper has announced their $300 million Fund 8. The thesis for Fund 8 is largely going to be consistent with prior funds. They're focused on deep tech investments in industries that they feel have sort of stagnated or have plenty of room for disruption and innovation. They were one of the earlier investors in SpaceX, Tesla, and ICEYE, though their investment portfolio is by no means exclusive to the space and like deep tech or hard tech industries. Their sort of focus for Fund 8 will include AI, robotics, automation, crypto, blockchain, some healthcare, and aerospace and space technology as well. And then finally on the business moves, a little bit of a downer here, but Dish TV, subsidiary of EchoStar, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is another hit to the traditional geo market. Dish TV has been one of the stalwart purchasers, one of the stalwart customers for the majority of our sort of working careers. And I mean, ultimately what happened was paid TV, the traditional sort of TV industry and market, shifted underneath them. It shrank pretty substantially over the last 10 years or so, 5 to 10 years. And so, the infamous words of, when a clean jockey rides a horse on a muddy track, it's usually the jockey that gets dirty. The track doesn't usually get clean. And this is one of those examples that despite everybody's best efforts, when the industry got rough, when the industry got messy, there wasn't a whole lot you could do at sort of the individual level or at the company-wide level to really fix that. It's a shame to see, but effectively, the 2024 merger between EchoStar and Dish TV left the company with 25 or so billion in debt that it's really just sort of had difficulty repaying, in large part because of the severely reduced demand for pay for TV. One of the potential solutions that the CEO Ergen was attempting to solve was to sort of pivot Dish TV into a communications company, less of a pay for TV service and more of a satellite communications play. But that's just been difficult to execute, especially with that 25 billion in debt. It's a pretty hefty burden to fulfill through any sort of pivot or strategic change.
Yeah, I'm gonna pour one out for Jupiter 3. That's the program we met on. It launched like a couple years ago.
Yeah, I lost most of my hair on Jupiter 3.
It was a fun program, but that was an expensive satellite. So not terribly surprising they went bankrupt trying to fly those kind of spacecraft.
Yeah.
It is unfortunate, but I don't know. Now that I mean, they had made this indication late last year when they sold their spectrum rights that the rest of their company was struggling and they were cutting costs. So, long time coming, I guess. It'll be interesting if anything of EchoStar manages to survive, or if them selling their spectrum was kind of them exiting their market. But they've been a stalwart in this space, so
they have.
Unfortunate. Lastly, for today, we have a couple of tech advances. Firstly, BAE has validated their Endura space processor. They did this on Orbit. It is a 45 nanometer chip that was manufactured by Global Foundries. The design is a system on a chip. It is meant for processing, networking, secure boot, and other functionality. So I read that as everything. It is a fully functional flight computer. This is great. There are not a lot of options for rad-hardened space computers. It is one of those kind of sub-components that lags terrestrial capabilities. You can go straight to AMD and get one that, by the specs I saw on BAE, is more capable. So it's not like BAE is setting the record here, but it is nice to have another option to go to. I don't have the full spec sheet in front of me, so my guess is this one is cheaper than getting one from AMD. Of course, you have some other options to go with here, but given BAE's expertise, I would expect it's a very capable chip. It's got level 1 and 2 caching, which is great for speed. They also have FPGA components to accelerate their I/O, which is also great for speed. So, we talk a lot about BAE with like imaging applications. This chip, to me, seems like it's meant to handle pulling in a lot of data from many peripherals and handling that. So great to see another flight computer. I think it's getting more attention, flight computers, recently with like all the ODC stuff. So while not explicitly kind of correlated, I feel like BAE is announcing this now, that there is more demand for on-orbit computing capability. So they could see some real demand for this outside of their core competencies. And I think it does play into kind of the trend that we've been seeing with some companies starting to sell components on top of just being a space system company. Like we talked about last week with Umbra selling their reaction wheels, talked about with Northrop Grumman selling their star trackers, Rocket Lab selling their electric propulsion unit. It looks like BAE is kind of doing the same thing, but with space processors, which is another key component that could really use some improvement. And on the solar cell side of things, Verde Technology has shifted their solar technology to space. Their solar tech is foreground up to this point. It is a perovskite-based solar cell, which is relatively new. We talk about solar cells typically in like the high-end MERCAD kind of specialized compound sort of space, sort of solar array. And more recently, like silicon technology. So I think we talked about Celestial recently being acquired by York Space. That was a silicon-based, flexible, thin film solar array. And silicon is very common in space applications, primarily just because it gets around some of the supply chain constraints that you get with things like MERCAD or indium gallium arsenide. And using a material that's much more available, but the manufacturing of silicon is a bit tricky and costly. So the perovskite material is based on the perovskite principle, which turns heat to voltage. It has some quirks to it, but Verde Technology seems like they figured that out, at least for terrestrial applications. And if they're able to expand this to space, it does reduce the cost of silicon by 50%. So this is an impressive improvement. I know perovskite's been investigated quite a bit in the past, but I haven't seen one that purports to kind of replace existing silicon. Usually it's like a backing to silicon to capture waste heat. So if they're able to do a fully perovskite solar array, and it really does reduce cost over silicon, this is an awesome option to see. And it comes at a great time as the crunch for solar array technology is growing. Much like computer chips, orbital data centers is amplifying the need for this sort of technology. So let alone having a new technology entering the option, like the options to buy, it's just great to see another company that can supply technology and just getting around supply chain constrictions alone is great to see, but having an improvement in cost is also great. Seeing that we're having satellites with growing power demands, like everything's going up to 100 kilowatts and above, we definitely need more solar technology options out there. That's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.